Thank you all for joining us today. I am Dorian Traub, and I am the co-director with Darby Saxby of the USC Center for the Changing Family. And you are here today to hear a fantastic panel of individuals speak about the technology of caregiving. Before I introduce you to our amazing speakers, I want to give you a little bit of background if you aren't familiar with the Center for the Changing Family. Perhaps this is your first event with us. But we are a multidisciplinary hub at USC for family studies researchers and research. And we focus on the close relationships and family dynamics that unite our thriving community. We have over 75 faculty and student affiliates from across the university, and we share a vision to understand and support families across the lifespan. We are very multidisciplinary. We have individuals from economics, psychology, pediatrics, gerontology, sociology, creative writing, law, social work. And the thing that unites all of us is our focus on the womb to tomb development of life, infancy to late life. And we use a wide range of methods and topics to explore that. This is important for us because we believe strongly that the family is both a springboard for policy debate and a crucial resource for social resilience in a changing world. Public systems and policies affect families deeply in sectors ranging from incarceration, immigration, healthcare, and education. And the USC Center for the Changing Family is positioned at the epicenter of these sectors to ensure that policy and service decisions are driven by the best research available to ensure families have the greatest opportunity to thrive. Today, we are joined by four fantastic individuals who are working in various areas of technology and its intersection with care. First, I want to introduce you to Siran Can, who is from Mirza. And Siran is a first-generation immigrant, daughter of a single mother, and co-founder and CEO of Mirza, which is a startup that's reshaping employer-driven financial products, especially ones critical to building long-term financial health and to honor caregiving work. Mirza's first financial solution tackles the cost of care in order to give caregivers real choice around work and family. And Siran graduated with a degree in gender studies from Harvard and holds a master's degree from the London School of Economics and is kind enough to be joining us from London today. So that's exciting. Next is Avni Patel Thompson, who is founder and CEO of MILO. This is a smart central family inbox that makes parenting and collaboration be more connected. This is she is a third-time founder of building technology solutions that make everyday parenting lighter and more connected. Previously, she was the founder of the YC-backed Poppy, and prior to taking the entrepreneurial plunge, she spent spent over a decade building consumer business at P&G, Adidas, and Starbucks. She has an MBA from Harvard and a BSc in chemistry from the University of British Columbia. And then next is Dr. Harvey Karp. Dr. Karp is a world-renowned pediatrician and child development expert. He's celebrated for his Happiest Baby, Happiest Toddler books and videos, which have guided millions of parents and are translated into 30 languages. He is also the creator of the Snoo Smart Sleeper, a new class of responsive infant beds that adds 1 to 2 hours to baby's sleep and reduces the risk of infant sleep death by preventing dangerous rolling. Dr. Karp is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the USC School of Medicine, a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and an advocate for children's environmental health, and a board member of EWG. And last but certainly not least is Michael Levine. So Dr. Michael Levine is a senior president of learning and impact for Noggin, Nickelodeon's direct-to-consumer interactive learning platform for young children. It's an early learning and social, he is an early learning and social policy expert and is responsible for deepening Noggin's value to children and families through dynamic content, partnerships, and interactive experiences. He has a PhD in social policy from the Heller School at Brandeis and a bachelor's degree from Cornell. Thank you all so much. Those bios are so impressive. Not at all intimidating to the moderator. And but what I'd like to do, because we have, this audience that is raring to go. And so with that, I do want to mention to our audience that we have both a chat function if you'd like to interact with each other, and a Q&A function if you have questions that you want to post for the speakers. And I will be monitoring both and peppering those in. So please, we want to interact with the audience. If you have questions or comments, please chime in. Those will take precedence over any preordained questions that I have come up with. But to start, I will start with my first question, which I would like to ask each speaker if they can share the focus of their current work. And I think we'll just start with Siran, and I'll go around and ask each of you to discuss what you're currently working on.
Thanks, Dorian. So definitely when you were going through the bios, the first thing I thought was, oh God, I probably should have made mine short, because this group is just incredible. Yeah, so what we're building at Mirza ultimately comes down to how financial systems haven't been structured around care work and haven't been structured for the modern family unit. It's all based on this kind of antiquated one single breadwinner in the family notion. So the first thing that we're doing is changing the math of caregiving. That is most obvious when it comes to childcare. How often do you hear someone saying that, someone, usually mom, saying childcare is more expensive than my salary? So we're changing that by actually tackling care as this macro cash flow problem and spreading out costs over time, smoothing it into later periods when kids are in school and you have some access to free public education, and having employers support that smoothing, because ultimately care, if it's a math problem, there is some money missing from that math equation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Avni, can you share a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for having me. And I will touch on just kind of continuing on the math of childcare. The way that I came into the space, I did have this corporate career that I absolutely loved, solving a lot of consumer spaces. But as I became a parent and started to see the lack of really great technology solutions in the spaces and the frictions that we as parents face, my former company, Poppy, was very much in the space of childcare and trying to figure out how do you find and vet really incredible caregivers in our communities, and how do you connect them to families when they have gaps in care, really using technology to underpin the idea of a village that has like a safety net kind of backup component. And I've been pretty vocal about this, but as we built it, it became pretty apparent that it couldn't scale to the millions in the way that we wanted it to. And the reason for that is that the math is broken in a number of different ways. And so it's so exciting for me to hear about folks that are specifically focused on that piece and trying to unlock that in different ways. But since working on Poppy, my interests have taken really down the software kind of path, which is, what is the role of software and technology in, as I was saying, like making everyday parenting a little bit easier. And I think about it from, we have all this incredible investment in productivity and communication and collaboration at work. Well, our family units, as they have kind of progressed and evolved, are no less complex, certainly so critical. And while I started this company before the pandemic has put such an incredible point on it and such incredible pressure, where work is home and home is work. And so what I look at is, what is the role of software in enabling information to not reside in mom's head, mom's inbox, but instead allow it to be an essential place that makes collaboration amongst, yes, if you're lucky enough to have a partner, but then all these other incredible people that happen to be, nannies, grandparents, neighbors. The more that we silo the information and the data, the harder we make it to provide that really great care across a number of different people. So that's a lot of my focus on my work today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Avni. Harvey, can you share a little bit about what's happening at Happiest Baby and Snoo?
Of course. My interest is really in supporting families in those early years of life. And Snoo is a responsive baby bed that imitates the womb experience. So when you say womb to tomb, we're really actually babies. There's a concept called the fourth trimester, that babies are born 3 or 4 months before they're really ready for the world. And we hold them and rock them and shush them. That is an area where a lot of new parents don't have experience because they haven't taken care of their siblings and cousins the way it used to be, and they don't have extended family around. And it turns out that there's a concept, well, really a stressor in young families, which is that parents are exhausted. Many surveys have shown that's the #1 stressor in the first 6 months of life. And not a trivial one. It can lead to billions of dollars of healthcare costs, from postpartum depression to marital stress to child abuse to unsafe sleeping practices, obesity, breastfeeding failure, et cetera, and billions of dollars of employer cost from poor productivity, poor retention, errors and accidents, healthcare costs, et cetera. And it turns out that as the family has changed, the expectations that parents have had haven't changed. And so what I mean by that is young parents today expect that they're supposed to do everything for their kids because that's what a normal mom does or a normal dad does. And it turns out that the family, as you well know, in the Center for the Changing Family, has changed dramatically over the last 100 years. And while we moved away blithely from the village and the town where we live with extended family, now we've got, we're living on our own, and many people don't have that extended family support. So we created Snoo to imitate the womb and to imitate a responsive caregiver. So it's a baby bed that rocks and shushes and responds when the baby is upset with more rocking and shushing to help calm the baby and extend sleep. Our goal with that ultimately is to rebuild the extended family. And so that Snoo can be a 24-hour caregiver for parents over the first 6 months of life. And our goal is to have that funded by third-party payers, so insurance companies and governmental agencies, and to be able to scale that really to the entire nation and really the developed world. So we're working on that now. And right now we've gotten it to the point where you can access this 24-hour caregiver and baby bed for about $5 a day, which we believe is really getting to the scalable point of childcare during these early 6 months. So right now we're working on building the evidence base for using that in the homes and in hospitals, as well as an assistant nurse, and then getting the evidence base so that we can persuade third-party payers to foot the bill.
Amazing. And I know every time I mentioned this Tech of Care panel, somebody said to me, oh, I have a Snoo. Oh, I want a Snoo. I'm so jealous of the Snoo. So I know we'll have a lot of people with questions about the Snoo for sure. Last but certainly not least, Michael, can you share with us what's happening with Noggin? I think we have a lot of, especially audience members, who particularly were hit hard by early childhood education during COVID and are very, very indebted to Noggin. So if you could share.
Thank you. Really a pleasure to be here. What a treat and a privilege to be on this esteemed panel. So my background, so I'm Michael Levine. I head up, I'm a recent addition to the Nickelodeon and Noggin team. There's a new team that's trying to transform Noggin, which has been around for a while, but is now reemerging as a digital age early learning platform. So we take the power and the magic at Noggin, and my background is in child development research, public policy, and philanthropy. Californians might know some of the work I did in the 1990s to bring You First 5 with Rob Reiner, which was one of the big things that I did after a stint at Carnegie Foundation. So after 2 decades of working on public policy issues at scale, I decided that mass communications technologies and the digital age were central to influencing the well-being of families and children and creating more equitable solutions. And so my latest venture is into creating sort of a digital age Sesame Street based at Nickelodeon. So Noggin uses the power of role models like Dora and Peppa Pig and Blue's Clues to teach a whole child curriculum to 2 to 7-year-olds with valuable life lessons, as well as an evidence-based curriculum that we're delivering. I think during the pandemic, all rules changed around technology, and of course, unfortunately, for a lot of businesses, they took advantage of that in a way that was not necessarily supportive of children. We tried to do the right thing. We've grown quite a lot. I've become concerned, and we'll talk about this today, about too much consumption of media forms. And I'm not critical of what families and parents and educators have needed to do during the pandemic. I think that we've learned quite a lot about what's possible and what's not. But I am worried that these media forms have become destinations that are, exit ramps for children, and they need to be entry ramps, and they need to be a catalyst and a launch pad for more learning outside of the technology environment. So what we've been doing at Noggin is trying to think that through. So part of our response to COVID, and part of our thoughts about scaling the technology to be relationship based, is to add partnerships with organizations that are providing real world support. We have partnerships with NASA to talk to the space scientists in space live. We have partnerships with Alvin Ailey and the Med and yoga and mindfulness companies and Tinkergarten, other groups that are getting kids up, out of their chairs and doing things to extend the learning, sort of outside of the screen. So we're trying to redesign what we think would be a blended, supportive learning platform for today's, young people, both here in the US and globally. And I think that, the genie is out of the bottle, and we don't want to talk about screen time in the same ways as we once did, but we do need to think about technology and screens and new ways to support, co-participation, co-parenting, joint media engagement, new connections between home and school and community institutions. And because we have such mass appeal and so much brand equity and power, with that power comes great responsibility. And that's the conversation that I want to have with other colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you. And it's such an important point. The work that I do focuses on the infusion of technology into parent support. But when you're supporting parents, their children are sitting next to them. And so often that idea of is screen time okay, is really confusing to parents, because they need the screen time to get the support they need. But they're hearing recommendations from the American Academy of Pediatrics not to let them have screen time before a certain age and only a limited amount. So I completely agree with the idea that this is a very important conversation that we need to be having, that's much more nuanced than we have been. And that is probably one of the benefits of COVID, is that it did lift that veil a little bit for us. I now want to remind our audience that you can please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or the chat, whatever you would prefer. But for our panelists and anyone who would like to can chime in at this point, what do you think are some of the myths or mistaken expectations that we place on parents around their caregiving roles?
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think this big one is, like I was mentioning earlier, is that the normal family, or 2 parents and a child, and the expectation there is to do all of the care and be everything to your child. I'm just struck by all of the panelists here. In a certain sense, we're all in the same business, which is grandparenting. We're like a sandwich without the filling here. I mean, we got the bread, but the grandparents put in so much of this, mentoring the child, helping with a financial organization, helping to fill in the spots that are needed. And we really are missing that layer. I mean, I have a 6-month-old grandchild who's in New York City. I'm in Los Angeles. It's as much as I want to be there, I can't. And I know my daughter would be benefiting, and I would be benefiting, and my wife would be benefiting to have that extended family opportunity, which again was always what we had. And so I see that as being very pernicious in terms of the expectations of parents, because they should on themselves all the time, right? I should do this, I should do that, I should be able to. And even in the hospital setting right now, we have something which is wonderful called rooming in, where babies are put into the room with the mother, and we're encouraged to do skin to skin and breastfeeding, and that's all great. But there's not a culture in the world that would go up to a new mother and say, you know what, here's your baby, call us if you need us. It just doesn't happen. And so I think we have to recognize that fact. And actually, COVID has shifted things a little bit to people staying in the home longer. And we're seeing some of the data about that as well. But I think that's one of the huge myths. And if your expectations are set that you have to do everything, you're pretty soon going to hit a wall and feel pretty inadequate. And I think that that's an epidemic among parents. And it's the reason that's fueling one of the things we're seeing in pediatrics, which is really an incredible increase in postpartum depression and anxiety.
I want to just pick up on it. I think that is exactly the right formulation, Harvey. It is a myth that you need to do it. You need to do it all. And our democracy and our system does tend to, however, fulfill that myth, because we don't have the policy infrastructure that we need. We don't have paid family leave. We don't have adequate childcare. We don't have income supports for the most vulnerable. So this kind of, yes, it is a myth, but we also don't do what we need to do to remove the pressure on families to think that they need to do it all. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of technology on this, so we absolutely need to do much more around the social policy and the social welfare infrastructure in our community. You see some of this happening in states like California, and obviously in public policy presentations. But there is also, yes, something, as you're suggesting, about the stigma or the social expectations that we need to get at. And I think technology actually does have something to say about how to overcome some of these myths, but we're stuck in sort of the false dichotomy about technology is either consumption, productivity, entertainment, as opposed to the technologies that we need to introduce are ones that actually, and the Snoo is an excellent example of this, something that actually relieves the burden, that is a scaffolded support, that is, at least akin to some kind of a family equivalent function. Technology is not going to be the answer, but if we reframe technology around the kind of relationship capital that families need, as opposed to just productivity or fun, that's helpful.
Extend on that. I was just, I agree with everything that everyone has said, because I think that's the hardest part, where it just feels like a failure of self. If somehow you aren't able to figure all of this stuff out. We live in a society where we put the burden on the individuals, and then when there's failures, whether it's you forgot to dress your kid in pink shirt, or you forgot that it's a no school day and you're stuck without childcare, all of these different pieces, we make it feel like a failure of the individual, when it is alternatively a failure of the state for not providing other kind of ways of this. But I also think about the role of technology is, I think about it as a chassis. I think about it, I think for most of us, the conversation about technology is there's humans or there's tech, and there's the two ends of the spectrum. And what I like to think about is, how do you marry the humanity and the technology? We are a species that has advanced because of building technology, like the tools in the earliest kind of senses. And so you sort of abstract away the lower value kind of stuff, and you move on to like the higher value stuff. And I think about that, like, how do you do that with, what does that look like for technology? So to take the space that I work in, why is it that every parent gets an email with a soccer schedule, and every single parent has to individually input it into a Google Calendar? Take that 20 parents on one team times the 10 minutes. Where are we valuing that time? Why is it a secret of which day swim registration is? Why can't one person record it and then send it out to everyone else as a reminder with the link with all of the different things? I think for me, it's simply that we can. I mean, this is even the examples that I'm talking about aren't particularly hard tech. But we need to look at it in a way that we're not trying to change the humanity. The humanity part of it is that parents have each other's backs. We like to tell each other, but I'm not at pickup nearly as frequently because I work. And so I'm not having the conversations about when swim registration, what is the best, all of these types of things. Instead, I get reams of emails to then have to read and parse and do all of that stuff. If we go back to our humanity, which is parents want to tell each other, how do we rebuild technology that sort of mimics that, that allows one person to kind of, identify the thing, but then also communicate it in a way that's connected to our calendars, our alerts, whatever all those things are. So I think when we come back to failures, I think one exciting thing is that we are now, the wave of parents that are now becoming parents generally are digitally native. And there is an expectation that there ought to be thoughtful, nuanced technology that underpins every part of my life. And why isn't it here in parenting? And so I think we will have a shift in the acknowledgement and the acceptance of the technology that actually works. But that for me, I think is critical that we haven't gotten to yet.
Siran, do you have any thoughts?
So my mind keeps circling to all of how we are so scheduled now, more so for our kids than, well, when we were young. There's this entire system for kids of all of you have the soccer practice, you have the piano lessons, you have SAT tutoring, and there's also elements of that can be alleviated and supported by technology. And then there's also the supports of just, in some areas, well, this is the USC panel, and some of it is just around how our educational systems can start to change to be able to support and use technology in that space to increase class sizes and make higher education more readily accessible and alleviate some of that kind of downstream pressure. And by downstream, I mean earlier in the points in life pressure that kids feel more and more and parents feel more and more to be able to create the infrastructure for kids to succeed.
Such an important point, and I appreciate you drawing the connection to higher ed, because I was at an event last night where somebody was speaking about having to fill out the financial aid application for their child's preschool. And that pressure that if your child doesn't get into the perfect preschool, they're not going to get into the best elementary school, and it's just, you might as well close up shop. And I think this concept of what we are expected to do, and this is not a media panel, I get that, but we do perpetuate that in the media, and I remember as a new parent myself coming home from the hospital and thinking, oh, I have to take the baby out for a walk in the stroller because that's what I see in magazines. There's always like the celebrity who looks like they haven't had a child out for a walk. And I remember this woman that I lived near who came up to me and said, "Why are you out?" And by the time I had my second child, I thought that was excellent advice. I did not need to be out. But there is that pressure because we have, in a lot of ways, lost that village. So with that in mind, what, with caregiving being a very low tech thing, right? Done since the beginning of humanity, we've been caregivers. So what's to gain by adding technology? And we've certainly talked about the idea that it can, I loved, Avni, what you said about it being a chassis. It's such a great illustration. But what else do we have to gain by infusing technology into the way that we think about care, especially in a world of digital natives?
I'll just give one really quick example because I think I did touch on it in the piece that I spoke to last. But when I was building Poppy, there was a assumption that parents would not appreciate, a number of different caregivers that were that would support your family. That they needed to be like only one or two different people. And we proved that that actually wasn't the case, that if you can find the right people, children and the whole family benefits from a wide range of humans that you can put in front of them. And I am such a huge believer of this. But there is naturally friction. And where are the points of friction? One is, for anyone that has kids and has had a sitter or a grandparent take care of your kids, the rundown. When the person shows up and you have to go walk around the house and say, here's where the diaper is and the kids need to go to bed like this. And maybe you wrote down on a piece of paper. And it's like an added piece of friction because every single time there's a new person, or maybe the kids have grown by 6 months and there's a new phase, you have to re-go through all of that. Well, one thing that we were able to do is you're able to put that all into a digital central place where you were able to kind of put that in. You could even do things like a video walkthrough. You could literally just like walk through your house. You took a picture of your outside because in Seattle on cold, rainy winter nights, it's hard to find your house. We did little things like that so that between one caregiver to the other, they could read the notes, they could prepare themselves. And so then they walked in and says like, oh, little Johnny's into trains, or little like Sarah's into whatever else it is. And that's such a little point, but when you add these up and you notice the little points, technology isn't the solution. Technology doesn't take the forefront, but technology in this case enables the humans to do what they do best, which is that caregiver that walks through the door, they are educated because they understand your house and maybe you've talked through some dangerous areas, it reduces the incidence of adverse events. All of these different pieces we need to think about. It's not about leading with the tech, but it's about understanding what are we trying to do and enable and facilitate, and what are those little points that we can support it with thoughtful technology.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I mean, there's a really important thing that we've learned during COVID, which is, technology is a scale solution. I mean, take my, company, for example. I mean, you had over the 2 years of the pandemic so far, approximately 15 to 20% of all 3, 4, and 5-year-olds missing school entirely. And, I mean, obviously kids who are older, 10, 11, 12 are, facing similar issues, but they were able to participate in online learning in a very different way than a 3, 4, or 5-year-old could. So enter media companies like my own. And so instantly, over the period of some months, we added hundreds of thousands of subscribers to help mom and dad with, a smart schedule for kids that's delivered by Noggin or by Sesame or by, any other group. So the possibility of technology being an opportunity and equity driver is just sort of demonstrated that. And we suspended, I mean, at my company, we suspended all of our revenue for several months. Actually, we made Noggin available to tens of thousands of families for free for the last year and a half. So I mean, there is the opportunity for technologies, especially when they're developed by organizations that have other revenue streams, to be equity drivers. I think one of the things that we've also learned about the promise and the pitfall of technology is that it tends to expand gaps when there are sort of more sophisticated technologies that people don't have access to. Recent research from Rutgers and New America about the persistent number, actually millions of families are still underconnected or not connected in the United States, should be a national scandal. And technology could be a social, utility, could be just like, the heat and the lights if we did the right thing. So anyway, those were a few points.
I really appreciate the conversation about the digital divide. And I just have to say, I see my colleague Renee Martinez, who sits on the board of the California Emerging Technology Fund, with me in the audience. And this is one of the things we talk about, the digital divide from so many levels, and how it impacts people for their work. But it really does drastically impact parenting, and it's an important thing to keep in mind. Harvey, I saw you had something to add to this.
So I feel like there needs to be a little bit more definition of what we're talking about when we say technology. And Avni, you said it's a tool, just like we've always created tools. And I think that's the best initial overview to think about it. But some tech is there to make us more time efficient. right? And so the 10 minutes that you were talking about for the soccer parents, then you have 10 minutes more to do other things that are perhaps more enriching or valuable for your family. Tech at the same time can take away your time. And so I kind of maybe think about technology as being, one of the tools that we created is fire. Fire is incredibly valuable, and it's also dangerous, and it's mesmerizing. And I feel like the goals that we have are to figure out where the vitamin deficiencies are in the family, and how do we fill those deficiencies. It might be a time deficiency for some people. It might be a mentoring or entertainment deficiency, or that social glue deficiency because people are so separated and alone. And then really figure out, how do we structure our technologies so that we're best able to give people those options and choices to be able to enrich their lives in the way they want to, and at the same time recognize the fact that the way our brains are built, we automatically want to eat sugar and junk food, and we automatically want to fill our lives with scrolling Instagram because it's been so designed to appeal to that part of us. So we have to put guardrails up on the potential, and I would say dangerous aspects of technology that are just like we would in terms of other exposures to drugs and dangerous things in our society that we have to protect children and families from.
So, Siran, can I ask you, what do you think are some of the emerging tech of caregiving investments that are happening out there? I feel like you're on the forefront of some of these.
Very flattering. Thank you. Well, I will actually just say that I think what Avni is working on, how to use technology to relieve mental load, is something very much that is cutting edge. So we've definitely seen a lot now that is innovating around that family space and your time, and how folks are spending time, how you can better bring in folks to help support this overall family, the labor at home. There are a couple of startups that are working on platforms like this. I think Avni and I both know the folks over at Maple that have an app and a web app that help you coordinate. But then beyond that, there are then folks who are working in the space on bringing in, using technology to coordinate people who can come and help support with these various aspects of the scheduling and the coordination. And so what Avni is doing, and actually building it truly into technology itself for that mental load of someone, usually mom, having to remember, is I think what is that ultimate next iteration that we need to, I don't mean to say outsource part of our brain, but outsource the coordination that lives in our heads and gives us so much anxiety. I think what is very much needed though in this space is that when we start bringing in other humans, the way that I mentioned, there are startups that are bringing in folks to come support you at home. We need to also then build in the mechanisms, and in a very financial sense, make sure that that care is being compensated in the right way. So especially when it comes to not only that kind of work at home, but when folks are helping support with caregiving, like sharing school pickups and providing that kind of labor, it is so important that we start bringing in financial compensation in there as well in a thoughtful way, so we can actually start to really prove that there is monetary value to this work that we're doing. So much of what we've been talking about as the panel kind of dances around policy in a way. And this, I want to say outright, I think by us actually moving into a space where we can start putting dollar values on our care work and showing that the worth of this work, we're actually showing how care work adds directly to GDP. And the ways that we can actually create more policy change is when we show the actual dollar values.
And Harvey, I feel like that intersects a lot with your thoughts around the application of the Snoo as well, that it, there's a monetary aspect of parents or caregivers having adequate sleep and being functional human beings in society that has been eroded over time as we've eroded our care structures.
Yeah, we're very concentrated on that right now. We have a big push to encourage employers to provide Snoo as a benefit to their employees, and we make it available to them for approximately $4 a day. It's really what they were spending on coffee for their employees when they were coming to the office. But for that same value, they can give their employee a 24-hour caregiver, extra safety. One of the things we do with Snoo also is secure babies on the back. So one of our goals is to end the scourge of infant sleep deaths, which kills over 3,000 babies a year in the United States, and to support parents to reduce postpartum depression. So there are medical sides of that, which also affect the employer and the society writ large in terms of many levels of expense. But ultimately, really seeing the goal of starting with employers to build out the model of third-party payer for this type of support, because I think that, Michael, as you said before, one of the policies is paid parental leave, which, obviously the United States is far behind in doing that. Of course, that's not the end all and be all by itself. It's only a part of what we need to be able to provide. But I think that, to Siran's point, if we can prove the financial model, then that is able to persuade policymakers that we can afford to do this and do it on a large scale.
Michael, with that kind of idea in mind, we have seen during COVID this just infiltration of technology to support early education and education is in general. But, I think it was almost like we were so ill prepared in some ways and so fabulously prepared in others. But when we think about even learning platforms like Clever, Google Classroom, that teachers had to rely on, none of them are truly optimized, right? For they're a wide brush. They're not optimized. As a college educator, our digital learning tools are extremely optimized for a college student. We don't do that for anybody younger than college age. So I'd love to, if you could speak a little bit about this idea around the emerging tech investments in early childhood education and development.
Yeah, we're starting to do, more around, big data, right? Precision medicine. So, the quantified self is becoming, much more of a discussion, within early childhood circles. We do a lot more sort of AI-driven personalized learning, for example, on the Noggin platform, which is, it takes a long time to figure out, what a child's interests and passions are, but there are big data that allow us. For example, at our place, we've set up a totally new research operation, including, data scientists and, precision learning, types. So the data analytics revolution is underway, in early childhood and even at tech, media companies like mine, which are not, not Google, believe me, in terms of the engineers that we attract. So there is that going on, sort of the personalization movement. I do see it, like I'm on a bunch of different boards, both in early childhood and I've done a lot of work in school reform as well. And so the high dosage tutoring movement is, becoming very, very prominent in terms of being able to, again, personalize and be able to, narrow in on the, sort of a response to intervention, approach. You're seeing it in social work around, home visiting, but also just the ways in which crisis text lines or other things are driven by data, by science, by precision. So I do see this happening. Obviously, the flip side of this, if you want to see it negatively, is the worries that we have about the kind of privacy and digital advertising that basically brought our democracy to its knees, via organizations that I will not mention here in polite company. But so, I mean, we do kind of have to think about these benefits and these, plus sizes of, technology with a careful eye. But I do, I'm like I still see the glasses half full if we can figure out how to connect the expertise of social workers, doctors, educators, sort of the human touch with the tech touch. And we've talked about that for decades now, and I don't think the digital promise has been fulfilled, but I do think that the pandemic has taught us, a thing or two that we need to apply in innovations of the future.
I love that. I love, it's been a while since I've thought about the digital promise, and here I am at the forefront of thinking about technology. But that is such an important point. We've had some people, first of all, I want to point out that some of our folks in the chat have been so grateful to have you all just elevate the idea that we place almost all caregiving burden on the direct caregiver, and just how gratifying it was for people to hear us say that, because I think we do silo people into spaces where we've told them that that's normative, and it should not be. But we've also had a couple of questions, and I'd like to turn this over to Avni now, because I think you have a unique perspective in this world of leading startups about scaling and where the current investments are happening in the sector. Somebody in our Q&A posted that their child has no less than 6 platforms by which they're expected to communicate with the school.
Of course, it's America. We have 17 different brands of toilet paper. Why wouldn't we?
Why would we have it? But it's an interesting tension, because I'm here saying, well, we haven't invested enough. Like, why haven't we invested more in the technology of care? And yet we have, in some places, we have lots of methods for parents to communicate with the school. The Shutterfly Share site, the Bloom site, like all these sites. But that there are still these huge deficits in care. So could you speak a little bit about that, Avni, about how we scale these solutions and where the investment in the Silicon Valley comes from in certain sectors, like why there's a hyper focus in certain sectors?
So I'll try to keep it simple, because it's a deep, complex kind of ecosystem. But at its core, I think we have a mechanism of, like, either, if you want to call it either capitalism and the markets, or venture capital and some of these pieces. Venture capital is basically a risky bet. It's money put in an idea that can reinvent the future in some massive kind of way. So all of these are bets, frankly. And on some hand, like, you could take a look at it and saying, like, the sheer waste of money of, like, the millions and millions of dollars that go to things that fail. But really, these are chips on things that will fundamentally change the way that we transact, the way that we live, the way that we do some of this. And so you almost have to, like, think about it in that way. Well, if you were to think about it in that way, and that's why, like, you'll see, like, the Googles and the Facebooks, because, like, and even Airbnbs and things like this, where there was maybe a slow build as you figured it out, but then a massive kind of, like, uptick in the exponential curve. What we then have to marry that with is spaces where there just aren't the same dollars, where the value is not extracted, like there's value creation. So again, an MBA. So I come from the world of, like, yes, consumer and psychology, but I come from the world of markets and dollars, which is, you have value creation, you have to have value extraction. And that just means simply, what are you building that creates value? And then how can you be rewarded for showing up at creating that value? Well, the challenge is in the space of care, and I'll just use childcare as an example in this space, but it's like, it's in teaching, it's in nursing, it's in all up and down, like, the care economy. The challenge is that for so long, we've subsidized the value creation in childcare with anything alternatively called, like, the goodness of people's hearts, or, like, people frankly being underpaid for the value that they bring to the table. And so you have markets that ought to be massive from a, like, generalized concept of, like, the value that's created or why you might want something, but you're simply just not able to extract that same kind of value. And so what you start seeing in either schools or childcare and things like that is you go towards the money. So where is the money? It's in advertising, it's in affiliates, it's in employers, it's in school boards. It's not, I say this, none of it with value judgment. This is how we've built our economies today. So if you're intent on building a business that can be viable, that can scale, then you go towards where the money can be. And so you have to then trade off user experience and, you know, how deeply you solve the user problem with how can you maintain a viable kind of business. And I would argue that in looking at a number of different categories in the space, the tension is greater when we're talking about these spaces. And so when we think about the school, the 6 different, I mean, I live it, I've got a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, so I live it in spades. Where are the incentives? If the incentives are to sell into a school board and not really worry about what else is there, and like, I certainly don't want to say that people don't care about the user experience. They do. Like, these are people that come into these spaces and work tirelessly because they care about the space. But when you're asking about trade-offs, about like, I live to fight another day because I have a company that's sold in and isn't necessarily worried about how it plays with all the other things, versus not, that's what you kind of see some of these tensions and these trade-offs. And so again, it's a super complex kind of space, one that so many of us, there are founders that are building in the space, have to navigate. It's complex because you're trying to create something that works at a certain scale. And that's what we tried to do with Poppy. We had it in Seattle, serving thousands and thousands of parents. But when we continued to grow it, beyond it feeling like a community kind of thing, and it started to feel more like a gig economy kind of thing. So instead of driving for DoorDash or Uber or something, you would go to Poppy. When you start to bring it down to that transactional level, you're not paying people enough to do that kind of job. And then if you start to think about the cost to go bring it to other markets at the scale, the quality, and the affordability that parents and everyone in the system absolutely deserve, that's where it starts to break down. And so I think for me, what that comes down to is then how now a lot of the things like Siran, what you're working on, which is like, we have to fundamentally relook at the economics and the math and how we are looking at that transaction such that we can give people the high quality kind of experiences that we all deserve in spaces that we're not traditionally. So it's not fintech, it's not even, and healthcare is, remarkably complex, as we all know. But those are some of the pieces just to understand under the hood. And then the last thing I'll just say is a number of us are a part of like the Care Force, which is this organization that we kind of pulled together to say it's not just about private solutions operating in a silo and trying to build. We want to be able to have collaboration with policy and with academia and all of these other levels that we can put our best thinking forward to try to have breakthrough in some of these spaces where you might be able to just be a private company putting forth a market solution, and that might be enough. I think what we're now advancing the conversation to collaborate and find different solutions. I think that there's a lot of promise there too.
Yeah, Harvey.
Just a quick comment on that. I think that maybe I especially in caregiving, you have, as you were saying, Avni, you have value creation and value extraction. But in between those two, you have something else, which is really value assessment and value optimization. And I think that in caregiving, we've discounted what the value is. And I think we've learned during COVID that the value is actually greater and has more impact on the general society than it was being recognized for. And so part of our job, I know part of my job, is to help people who have the funds recognize that this is actually more valuable than you were thinking it is. Here's how to think about it. And there are good studies coming out in terms of the cost of the impact of the negative things. And actually now I was just talking to, I was on the call with the group at Harvard. It's called the Center on Human Flourishing. But it isn't just stopping the bad things. How do we create the good things? How do we create sense of agency and competence and success and confidence and bonding so that parents feel enriched and the children live in a world where they're surrounded by people who feel enriched? And I think that we're just learning how to value that. And until you can make that value assessment, then you don't really know how to extract the value and how much to demand for that.
That's a fantastic point. And I think one of the points that I'm most optimistic about post pandemic, if there can be a point that people are optimistic about, is that there's a fundamental shift in conversations in employers, perhaps not at the government level that we need it to be right now, but it is changing. And I think that's such a fantastic point, that the appreciation of the value is changing.
Avni, I want to highlight something that you said as well around how we have historically subsidized care out of the goodness of people's hearts. And I think this applies across the lifespan. It's not just, in early care that like we've been talking about. And Michael and I have been in a lot of spaces together where we are deeply concerned about the rate of compensation for our early childhood educators. The vast majority of preschool teachers are on public assistance themselves. And every parent will tell you how much those services cost out of the individual's pocket to be able to access. Same thing with elder care, or when, trying to find caregiving to keep a person inside their own home is phenomenally expensive without a lot of places of support. Siran, I'm wondering if I can tap on your knowledge, because you spoke about this, about how that we've undervalued care in this society, and that some of like monetarily undervalued it, and some of what we need is more structural reform. So where do you see that going in terms of care, and how technology can support that structural reform and the valuing of care?
So I guess I'll start with some of how to get that revaluing happening, forcing the conversation. I wish I were more optimistic to think that this would be able to be a much bigger conversation if just on a government level alone. But I think the past year has shown us that the willingness to budge is not that high. All of the political interests, unless actually aligned, unless care work were counted as part of GDP. And how else do you do that but by actually paying for it and paying fair wages for it? Then that until that point in time, we're not going to get that level of movement needed. So that's in part why I think we're building Mirza the way we are, because it's truly pushing money into the system. And the way that we envision a future that Mirza is able to, as an institution, fund providers directly, means that there's so much interesting opportunity in actually creating that kind of space with the same financial mechanisms used on Wall Street, but in a way that it actually benefits care providers and boosts their earnings. So that as over time, what funds are actually pushed into care change, that gives a larger political impetus. But in the meantime, I'll also kind of touch on the fact that in the past year, while there was so much debate over the political agenda, and then a huge conversation in the tech space about the potential of crypto and Web3, I think there haven't been a lot of intersections, but I think there might be some folks who are working on that now. And I think about it as an example of if we actually start to create the ways that we use this very modern next-gen infrastructure to start to compensate for care work. And if I were able to provide tokens that compensate for care work and have that undergirded in this new financial system that then also starts to contribute back into that same, I guess, fiat economy, because all of those tokens ultimately wind up trading back into, well, you can trade it into USD. So there are just these various mechanisms now that are really exciting on the forefront of, well, new technology that can actually create and put and assign value where traditionally we haven't before. And it's a very, that concept of a care coin is a very strange concept, but at the same time, it's not. We assign monetary value with fiat for something that we've chosen. So for a new currency, why can't we choose to assign that for a different kind of work?
Siran, I think that's such an interesting idea. I feel like partnering also with, some philanthropies that are devoted to, sort of monetizing the care economy is an interesting thing. I don't know whether you've had any conversations with the folks at Ethereum and the Ether, but I mean, there are some folks who are actually interested in things like a care coin. And this may be the way to kind of, use the disruptive nature of technology to actually make a systemic change, because we absolutely are 100% stuck in wet cement with the political structures that we have.
I think, and just to even add to that, I couldn't agree with you more. And as I've been digging into more of the Web3 and looking at some of these, if we think about GDP as the measure, it's I think anyone who's ever looked at it in depth recognizes it's flawed along a number of different measures. It was built in a time when it was more around productions of physical goods and labor and things like that. And even if we think about our service economy, it doesn't do justice to what we produce and value today. But even as we think about what we would otherwise call right now Web 2 and just incentives, right? Just incentives and how we build our systems. I think it still is so early, but the more that I dig into exactly what Siran was talking about with Web3 and allowing people to have aligned incentives and ownership and reward for showing up and doing the work. These are some of the foundational first principles that I think are very compelling, that might allow us to have categories and services that were challenged from an economic standpoint in Web 2 to actually flourish in a Web 3 space, which I love the juxtaposition of exploring something like that.
Thank you. So I'm intrigued to ask our panelists now, is the use of technology just a Band-Aid for major reform that we need, or could perhaps it be a catalyst, as Michael mentioned? And whoever would like to chime in, please, because that's a deep question, I recognize.
Well, I think I'll pick up on this topic that we started with Michael and Avni on Web3, because ultimately building something in, taking a care coin as an example, that then directly actually can contribute into GDP, that forces a conversation and it forces a redesign of GDP, or how we actually think about counting economic value. So I think technology can truly be that mechanism to do that. But in a way, there's also in this sense, I think I'm a little more blue skies optimistic that if we can actually launch something like this right, then that supplants and builds a new system that we don't need to use GDP as the be all end all metric anymore.
In a certain way, tech might be in better position, as you're suggesting, to disrupt the early childhood non-system. Because if you look at K-12 or healthcare systems, they have the advantage of being heavily financed, right? But the disadvantage of being caramelized and bureaucratic. The early childhood system seems more ripe for this kind of disruption because it's patchwork and there's less fighting to protect the interest. I mean, it's just an interesting proposition that's being made here, Dorian.
I think similarly, I'm an eternal optimist. I think you have to be a founder. But I think we face potentially the same decisions that were faced in 2000 and early, it is the builders that ultimately make the decisions and the trade-offs and how all of this stuff gets built. And what's so exciting is that we are on the precipice of that, but it still will come down to the people that are down on the ground actually building all of these and making the trade-offs. And so for my part, I think it is incredibly exciting to talk about a care coin and then talk like the people who have and come to the table with the thinking of like all the trade-offs that need to happen to be at the table to then construct something like this. At the same time, there are huge dollars in early education or education just in general, or any of these different places. And so it's equally possible that you also have different systems being built still with the same old order or kind of things that we're trying to build towards. And so I think that's where it's so early kind of aspect. But I think it's so exciting to have the opportunity to kind of be there, re-architecting something that could be new and different. But I still think it comes down to the people that have the cross-collaborative experiences of saying, you have to think about the people that are in this social stratum and this kind of economic kind of point of view, as is the people that maybe like live in like at the other ends. And I think that's a conversation that we haven't necessarily been having as we're building some of these. And so that's one piece that I'm excited to bring to the table.
Yeah, Harvey, I'd love for you to chime in on this, because I know, especially Snoo, and having spoken to you about your goal to get that as a medical device that's, reimbursable by insurance is so important for a wide population to access. But I would love to hear your idea on this idea of tech as a Band-Aid.
Well, I think that what I wanted to say is maybe introduce another piece of the puzzle that is really important to consider. And perhaps it's really the work, Michael, that you've been doing a lot with children in terms of building a sense of citizenship and purpose and awareness of others, and these qualities that we want to engender in as children are growing, to be able to help them be good individuals and good parts of the society. Excuse me. And I feel that while there's a lot of responsibility on policymakers and the people with the dollars in their pockets, there's a lot of responsibility on each one of us as well. And so there's an aspect to reintroducing into the culture the value that each one of us needs to give to our family and our community, and encouraging that in as many different ways as we can from a top-down side. So for example, one of the things that I think would be very important in the future is a universal draft, where it doesn't have to be a military draft. It can be, working in childcare, working in other centers. Yeah. Where people are indoctrinated into the American system, which is to give to each other. E pluribus unum, we are interdependent. And I think that we've kind of forgotten that. And so from a social dynamic point of view, there's a values issue that we were saying, well, people aren't valuing caregivers. Well, we're not valuing ourselves as needing to build these bridges in our communities. And I think that that's something for us to also consider in this process. And that gets to our own individual responsibilities towards our caregivers, towards our preschool teachers, and the appreciation we give. And I know a lot of parents will provide school goods and whatnot, to help facilitate what has to be done in the schools. But I think that I just wanted to be really clear that it's very much a two-way street, and we all have responsibilities for moving away from our town and our interdependencies. And we need to recognize, maybe we're not going to move back to the little town, but we live in a community, and we owe something back to that community. And that's where technology gets kind of tricky, because how much are we being mesmerized by technology in the one hand, and that's taking away our time and our energy and our sense of connection that is really important for building ultimately what our society is going to hang together through, which is our interdependence.
This is a great segue, Harvey, too, into an audience question that just came in, because when speaking about the social responsibility of care, which clearly we tend to have eroded. And I just had this conversation in a class that I was talking about, where we speak about resilience. And one of the key factors for children to be resilient is to have at least one caring adult in their life. That statistic drives me crazy, because where are all the adults? There are a lot of adults. Why do you only need one? We need like all the adults. But in this, on the flip side of that is also the social responsibility of companies, of tech companies, as we do this work. So one of our audience members asked, how do we keep making progress in child tech while also being mindful of environmental harm? And it sounds like Noggin and Nickelodeon are doing some of that. Michael, could you share some of the work that you all are doing around environmental harm and technology?
Yeah, sure. I'm glad to. And thanks, Yvonne, for bringing up this important topic. So one of the things that we think we need to do is to communicate to kids about the science behind climate change, that there's so much misinformation and so much discord around climate facts. So a couple of things that we've done are, one, we've actually added climate justice and environmental sustainability to be part of our curriculum and part of the work that we're doing, not only at Noggin but throughout Nickelodeon and MTV and Comedy Central and sort of across the Paramount universe. We have a new initiative called Content for Change, which is prioritizing investments in creation of work that relates to emotional health and climate change and climate justice. So that's number one. It's sort of an organization-wide priority for us to produce stories that are based on evidence. Beyond that, our scholar in residence, Dr. Lori Takeuchi, who's at the National Science Foundation, and I put a link to this in the box, created a communicating to children about climate change forum for over 600 scholars, media creators, designers, practitioners. A few weeks ago, actually in the middle of February, you can go to that link and hear the panelists from Disney, from Nickelodeon, from YouTube, from Yale, who are experts on climate change communication strategies. What we really think we've got is the beginning of a strike force that's demand driven. If the kids know, we're leaving a lot of burden on the plates of our children. But just as, I followed the tobacco control movement that was stimulated by Dr. Julius Richmond in the 1970s. A lot of it was demand driven. And if we can get the kids aligned and give the kids the facts and the evidence and create a strike force that is not just Greta, I'm hopeful that we'll make accelerated progress on climate change. And then finally, we're doing our own sort of internal stuff around carbon blueprints and travel and a bunch of other things. If you want to read it online, there's a Paramount ESG, environmental sustainability, report that will talk about how we're keeping a scorecard, every year of our own corporate, policies and influence on the planet.
Harvey, what are you all doing at Snoo around this topic?
Well, near and dear to my heart, I've been involved in the environmental movement for over 30 years, working on children's environmental health. So I love that content formation that you're talking about. And at EWG, I think we would love to partner with you in terms of disseminating content, because we have a wide contact with hundreds of thousands of families and a good ability to kind of get things out. So that would be really fantastic. Yeah. With Snoo, it's we developed it so that it would be recycled. If it's something that you use for the first 6 months, who wants to buy it and then stick it in their garage or whatever. So we're also use organic cotton, which is a long-term strategy to help support farmers who are trying to raise crops in a more sustainable way. And so from that point of view, we are, we feel like we're really trying to reduce the waste stream and help parents recognize that they don't need to acquire more things. It's really part of that shared economy concept. So that's a big part of our DNA.
Thank you. And then I want to get to a question that was put early in our Q&A, and I'm going to turn this one over to Avni and Siran to tackle first, which is really about, we're talking about one end of the spectrum of care here, which is as children. But one of our participants was talking about the fact that, we have many individuals who would be considered wounded warriors, who now, are young caregivers. We have young caregivers for veterans. We also have a huge generation of baby boomers who are aging. And so there's the sandwich generation of people caring for young children and caring for aging adults. What can the tech care sector, or what are they doing about that right now? And thinking about how that kind of care feeds into this idea of the GDP.
I could speak to that's not generally been the space that I've focused on, but in being in childcare, it's really hard to not think about the whole spectrum of care. So I think I've got two thoughts on that. One is a little bit more at the culture change level, which is we need to start valuing care as a profession. I think this idea, one of the hardest parts about building actual solutions that you pay money for is that people alternatively feel like it's a failure if you had to pay for something, that you had to get a paid caregiver or a sitter or things like that, like why I'm not able to take care of my kids or my parents or any of these types of things. I think the reality is, in so much as our society has moved towards moving for economic or educational opportunities, I think that's not going away, right? So I think we need to normalize this idea that care is a profession and ought to be treated as such. And so the amount of this economy, we haven't even touched on this, that is Black and gray, kind of a market for a number of different reasons. We need to move all of that, any work that goes in moving our caregivers to being appreciated, rewarded, all of the different pieces. The number of people that I would interview to come on to be a caregiver who would say, do you want my babysitting resume or do you want my real resume? And the fact that the words are even said like that is problematic, right? The types of skills that caregivers need to bring to the table would be incredible whether you worked in head office or as a caregiver. And so we need to normalize this idea that caregiving is a profession that is on par with any of these other types of things. And I think that will have impact, whether you're talking about childcare or elder care. And then I think the other piece is, for me, is that the more you make it economically sustainable, or the more you make it a profession, you will start rewarding the people that are really incredible, and their life's work ought to be in this space because they're really well suited towards that. But I think that we can also then envision really incredible opportunities like Teach for America, or these other ones where you go off and in between high school and college, you go and spend a year. How incredible could it be if we had programs where you were a caregiver for a year and you actually learned about care and our communities and all of that kind of stuff at a foundational point in your life? That would help not only, obviously, and frankly, this is one of the things that the early care force had actually come together to kind of look at in the earliest months of the pandemic, when parents like me were just so overwhelmed, and then there was young people that were underemployed at that point. We were trying to see if there could have been something there, and it was just so much stuff going on. And again, from a health and safety standpoint, it was complicated. But what the enduring idea there is that how do we start rethinking this whole category up and down? And so it's not just about childcare, it is about care. And so that's the only other thought I'd say, which is it's not really where I'm looking at from a technology standpoint, but again, technology can make that chassis a lot easier to put a program like a Care Corps together.
Siran, thoughts?
So that is an incredible answer from Avni, and it really just comes down to completely valuing the care work itself and making it a profession. So I'm not gonna just try to add any more to that. But I think ultimately, I guess at fear of sounding like a broken record, it all just comes down to how we compensate things. So the more we're able to actually truly put real value on this work itself. I think there's a fascinating startup in the care space called Otter that pays stay-at-home parents to be able to provide care. And there are models like that, I think, that could be really fascinating to apply in these different spaces as well. And then building in that kind of peer support and just making sure that we align those monetary incentives where we already have those kinds of pro-social incentives. So it reinforces it instead of trying to align incentives in a way that makes it more transactional.
Thank you so much for that. Harvey, did you have something you were going to add?
I did, just getting back to this idea about universal conscription or draft. I think that we have to compensate people. We have to value, there's no question. I think all of that is right. We have to look at the GDP from the point of view of real value in all aspects, not just in the aspects that we have our blinders on and we're focusing on. But I really believe that when individuals, listen, there's 2 billion people who in a second would exchange places with any American teenager if they only had to spend a year of public service and they could be American citizens. We have an incredible gift that we've been given by our generation before us, and we owe something back. And in that payment of time and commitment, we will be given a gift, which is the values that you learn when you give of yourself and when you build something, when you help others. And we might have to kind of make that happen. It might not be what a 17-year-old thinks they want to do, but now we've got longer lifespans. We've got more time to do more things in our lives. And I think that there is some implied value that we need to really ask our society, which is, isn't it worth it that you should give back? Don't you love your country enough, whether it's Canada or the United States or whatever country you're in? You know, you're getting so much, you should give back. And in that process, I think we'd be able to build a stronger democracy, a stronger country, a stronger sense of what it means to take care of each other. And all of that would feed the values thesis that is the foundation for, I think, everything we're talking about.
So can I add to that? I love everything that you said, but I think if you also marry it with some of these Web3 pieces and the coins, and like, you can actually financially incentivize some of this as well. So yes, it is goodness of heart. Yes, it is community, but yes, it also makes, it can potentially make kind of sense. So like, these are the new age thinkings that like, we need the best brains around actually pushing the agenda forward in this space. And in the same way, I don't want the brain drain to go all to finance or to some of these other kind of spaces, which great, but I also want my share of the best brains kind of thinking about some of these things in really new and interesting and sometimes weird ways. But I think like that's where it's really exciting about what's possible.
I think that is a fantastic note to end on, which is this idea that we do have the capacity to build a social movement around care that is financially feasible. And Avni, thank you for talking about the career tracks. We didn't get a chance to really dive into that today, but we do have a lot of students watching this panel, and I hope hearing folks like Siran talk about these financial models makes our students that are thinking they're going to go down a business track realize that they don't have to abandon the idea that they can focus on caregiving and human development.
Do business, do care, do it all.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you all so much for your time. This has been, my brain is gonna explode because I'm thinking about this. I spent all my time thinking about care, and I have thought today about things that I've never thought about as they relate to care. The Center for the Changing Family would like to invite anybody who's listening to continue this conversation with us. Please check out our website. We have lots of events that we like to host. One that is coming up that I just want to bring to your attention is that on April 23rd, Darby Saxby will be moderating a conversation at the LA Times Festival of Books on parenting today, navigating stress, health, and social upheaval. And that'll be on April 23rd at 10:30 a.m. in the Wallace Annenberg Hall. If you're going to be at the LA Times Festival of Books, please come by and see us. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Harvey, Michael, Avni, Siran. just so appreciate you lending us your amazing brains today, and for continuing to move the agenda around caregiving.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much
Thank
for
you much,
joining
Lorraine.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to meet you.